The morning sun barely crests the bamboo fence before the first shadow falls across the wooden porch. A pair of deeply calloused, cracked hands, stained brown from decades of digging in the red soil, tremble slightly as they dip into a woven sack. The old farmer's thick fingers cup a small mound of snow-white cassava flour, letting the fine, starchy dust sift slowly through his knuckles. It catches the early light, drifting down like dry snow against the heat of the dry season. Alex stands a few steps away, watching the flour settle on the cracked concrete floor. The old man's breath is heavy, uneven, catching in his chest. He doesn't speak. He doesn't have to. His dark, weathered eyes are fixed entirely on Alex, holding a silent, desperate question. He is waiting for a verdict that could either feed his family for the next 3 months or leave them entirely empty-handed. For months, the small workshop in the yard had been unsettlingly quiet. The heavy anxiety of volatile agricultural markets had pressed down on the wooden house like a thick blanket. Raw produce was being bought for pennies by distant traders, leaving the village exhausted and hollow. But today, the heavy air has shifted. The yard is thick with the sweet raw scent of freshly ground cassava and wet earth. Hello everyone, we hope you are finding peace in your daily work. But in our small village, a turning point rarely arrives with gentle warnings. It usually comes when the pressure on a family's shoulders grows too heavy to ignore, forcing a choice between survival and surrender. Alex tears his gaze away from the white flour on the ground and looks toward the bamboo gate. Outside, a long winding line of farmers is already waiting. Their rusted, ancient motorbikes are weighed down with heavy, bulging sacks of raw cassava. Their faces are tight, etched with an unsaid worry, waiting to see if this yard will be their salvation or just another broken promise. Beyond the thin bamboo gate, the dirt path hums with the low, unsteady rumble of idling engines under the climbing sun. Dust kicks up in small clouds, settling on the wide leaves of the banana trees. Tuna stands quietly near the edge of the kitchen porch, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her hands, dusted with a fine layer of white starch, hold a damp cloth she uses to absent-mindedly wipe the rim of an aluminum basin. Beside her, little Henry sits on his worn plastic stool, his small sandals barely touching the ground. His wide eyes scan the unfamiliar rush of people, unaccustomed to so many heavy footsteps crossing their normally quiet yard. For years, this countryside has been trapped in a painful, predictable rhythm. Every harvest season, massive middlemen trucks would arrive at the village crossroad, their drivers holding clipboards and dictating prices that barely covered the cost of last season's fertilizer. Alex had stood in those lines too many times. He had watched his proud neighbors bow their heads, silently accepting unfair, crushing terms because a rotting crop waits for no man's pride. When Alex finally made the quiet, firm decision to expand their small family workshop into purchasing and processing cassava flour for direct export, he wasn't just thinking about building a profitable business. He was thinking about a protective wall. He knew that the only way to truly secure the future of his own wooden house was to help elevate the hands that grew the food around them. Now, the workshop bustles with the rhythmic mechanical thud of the newly installed grinding machine. The heavy sound echoes off the wooden planks of their home, blending with the low, nervous chatter of local workers sorting the rough root vegetables. Alex steps firmly onto the wet concrete floor of the processing area, crouching to check the moisture content of a freshly milled batch. But choosing to do things the right way means inviting a different, heavier kind of pressure. He walks over to the nearest motorbike, wedging his shoulder under a 50-kilogram woven sack of raw cassava. The rough plastic fibers bite into his skin as he heaves it onto the wooden pallet. White dust and dry soil fall from the bag, coating his boots. He reaches for the next heavy sack, but another pair of hands grabs the opposite corner. It is the elderly farmer. Despite his frail frame, the old man's grip is rooted in a lifetime of moving earth. Together, they lift the heavy load. As the sack hits the wooden slats with a dull thud, the old man does not let go of the fabric. Instead, his hand slides over and firmly grasps Alex's wrist. The rhythmic thud of the grinding machine continues behind them, but for a moment, the bustling yard feels entirely still. The old man's voice is hoarse, barely rising above the mechanical noise. He looks down at his worn boots, ashamed of his own vulnerability, before looking up directly into Alex's eyes. He shares that because the workshop refused to match the crushing price drop of the distant middlemen, he finally has enough money to pay the remaining school fees for his orphaned grandson. He doesn't ask for charity, he just wanted Alex to know what a fair price actually buys. The local market price for raw cassava has just plummeted again overnight, sending a wave of panic through the district. Yet amidst the noise of the grinder, Alex stands holding a frayed blue notebook. He traces a line of ink with his thumb, staring at a purchasing price he promised the village. A number that completely defies the standard, cold rules of commerce and threatens the very foundation of his own family's fragile security. The morning heat begins to press down heavily on the corrugated tin roof of the processing shed. Alex steps away from the notebook, wiping his forehead with the back of his forearm. The work here is unforgiving. Have you ever noticed how the true weight of a business decision is rarely measured by the numbers in a ledger, but by the quiet relief carried in a neighbor's voice? His shoulders strain as he wedges his hands under yet another 50-kilogram sack of raw cassava, heaving it onto the heavy iron scale. Dust and dried earth cover his boots, but he doesn't pause. From the cool, shadowed quiet of the kitchen, Tuna walks out into the blinding glare of the yard. She carries a large, condensation-beaded clay pitcher of iced green tea and a tall stack of faded plastic cups. She moves gracefully among the waiting farmers and the exhausted workers, pouring the pale, fragrant liquid. She offers a quiet, respectful nod to each person, acknowledging their patience and their labor. She stops near the edge of the wet concrete porch, watching her husband. Alex stands perfectly still, the fine white starch drying on his skin. Across the yard, Tuna is carefully spreading wet, heavy starch onto large bamboo drying trays. She pauses, catching her husband's eye. She cannot hear the quiet conversation over the machinery, but she sees the tight grip on his arm. She sees the old man's shoulders drop, releasing months of silent terror. She nods slowly, offering a quiet permission for whatever Alex has to do next. Inside the small, shadowed office space near the kitchen, the noise of the grinder is muffled into a low hum. Alex sits at the scratched wooden table, his worn notebook open under the light of a single yellow bulb. If Alex keeps his promise and maintains the high purchasing price for the village, his own family's profit margin will shrink to almost nothing. He will be trading his own short-term safety for theirs. Alex stares at the numbers. Through the open window, he can hear the heavy splash of water as workers wash the thick soil from the freshly weighed roots. This is the exact moment most rural businesses make a fatal mistake. They view the farmer as a cost to be minimized, squeezing the labor force until the land is exhausted and the trust is permanently broken. But life in this village had taught Alex a very different kind of mathematics. He doesn't just choose the farmers, he chooses the long-term survival of the whole village over the immediate comfort of his own house. Outside, Henry's small laughter rings out as he plays near the bamboo fence, completely unaware of the invisible wall his father just built to protect them all. The afternoon sun beats relentlessly against the corrugated tin roof of the processing shed, trapping the heat inside. The work is physically punishing, demanding a rhythm that leaves no room for rest. Alex's shirt clings tightly to his back, completely soaked through with sweat. The spreadsheet drawn in blue ink is simple, but the reality it represents is harsh. This is the hidden friction of adding value to raw farm goods. The process of turning heavy, perishable roots into pure export-grade flour requires intense physical labor, massive amounts of clean water, and constant electricity. The profit margin they create by processing the flour is supposed to be his own family's financial cushion. But the local market price for raw cassava has crashed again overnight. The industry standard is clear. When the market drops, a buyer drops their purchasing price to protect their own profit. Buying agricultural products is not a zero-sum game. It is the slow building of a fragile ecosystem. If the farmers cannot afford fertilizer for the next season, the workshop will have no roots to grind next year. Trust, he realizes in the quiet of the kitchen, is not a sentimental luxury. It is the strongest, most resilient insurance policy a rural company can ever build. Alex picks up his pencil. He presses the graphite firmly against the rough paper, drawing a thick line through the lower market price. Next to it, he writes down the higher stable number he promised. His face is lined with deep physical fatigue, his hands coated in a thick, drying paste of white starch and red dirt. But as he calls out the honest, heavy weights to the farmers, handing them their slips of paper, his smile is bright and entirely open. Watching him wipe the sweat from his brow, a tight, anxious knot in Tuna's chest finally loosens. She realizes that the hidden cost of this journey wasn't the reduced profit margin on the spreadsheet, nor the grueling hours of physical labor. The true cost had been the heavy, invisible burden of responsibility her husband had been carrying alone in his mind. But seeing him now, surrounded by the radiant, relieved smiles of neighbors who no longer felt helpless, she understands something profound. This man is not just running a business, he is protecting the fragile hopes of dozens of families, and in doing so, he is building an unbreakable fortress of goodwill around their own son. As the evening light begins to soften and fade over the bamboo gate, the final motorbikes pull out of the yard, their engines fading into the distance. They leave behind the deep, satisfying scent of processed earth and fresh, sweet starch. Inside the cooling storage area, large woven bags of pure white cassava flour are stacked neatly from the wooden floor to the ceiling. On the side of each sack, the clean, simple logo of their family company catches the last golden rays of the sun. Little Henry wanders into the quiet shed, his small sandals tapping lightly on the concrete. He runs his hand over the rough, woven texture of the closest bag, carefully copying his father's daily inspection. Alex kneels beside him, his tired knees cracking slightly, and gently brushes a stray speck of white flour from the boy's forehead. The grinding machinery is finally silent, settling with a faint metallic tick in the cool evening air. We often think that protecting our family means closing the gate tight against the outside world, hoarding every coin we earn. But true safety is built when we open that gate, share the weight of the harvest, and ensure the hands helping us build our dream are also fed. The village outside is still poor, and the unpredictable global market will undoubtedly bring new storms to our doorstep tomorrow. But tonight, this small wooden house feels deeply grounded, rooted safely in the soil of a community that finally trusts the future. Have you ever had to choose between a short-term personal gain and doing what was right for the people around you? We would love to hear your story in the comments below.